Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restoretheglory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob. Good to see you again. How are you?
Jake, I'm doing well. Thank you.
I'm usually so right into it that I don't pause to ask, but I'm trying to improve there.
I'm looking forward to seeing you next week at our Bishop's Conference. When we're recording this, it'll be, by the time people listen, we'll have already had it.
We'll have already had it, yeah. So that's such a beautiful event to be able to be with the bishops and spend some time with them and grow with them and experience the Lord with them, play with them. It's great.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And so, listeners, you're coming in today, and we had a little bit of a break for a quote-unquote summer break, but Bob and I kind of chuckled when we realized the schedule was like, oh, it's just one episode that we're not, usually we would break for longer. But hey, we're excited. We like what we're doing here. So we thought, listeners, that we would start out this, I guess, new season, even though we don't really do it that way, but we would start out and kind of return back to the basics of healing. You know, I think Bob, it's, sometimes you can get so into stuff that you almost overcomplicate it. And it's nice sometimes to just come back to, what am I doing again? What is this again? How does this work? Stuff like that. And when we chatted just before, I think it's, as always, a great thing because we're both coming at it from our own angles, and we hope that will be a blessing for listeners. So, Bob, any kind of initial thoughts here to start us off?
Yeah, this kind of just came as you asked the question. I hadn't thought about it before, but a couple of weeks ago, my daughter Kristen sent me a text.
Okay.
And it was from book Interior Freedom from Father Jacques Philippe.
Yes.
And he made a statement that's pretty provocative when it comes to the healing world.
Okay.
And he's quoting the church fathers, and he says, it's not what happens outside of us, that harms our souls. It's our response to what happens that harms our souls.
Wow.
And so you can start to say, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And,
yes.
Jesus being crucified, it harmed him physically, but did it harm his soul?
Interesting.
And I think getting into the distinction there could, in terms of what are the basics of healing, that could be a good context for wrestling with it.
So springboard us into it then, because I think I know where you're headed and where you're going with that. But so if I'm understanding it, what I'm hearing him say is, no matter my trauma, no matter my wounds, no matter what's happened, those are going to happen, and you can't help it. You can't avoid those. But what really goes sideways is what you do with it internally. Is that what you think he's saying?
Yes. And that, again, we went back and forth on this because she was asking questions like, well, what about somebody who's a child and they're sexually abused?
Right.
Or abandoned, or, all these things that are very traumatic.
Yes.
Or neglect or anything else, or at any age.
Right.
The pain is real, and it has effect. And so I think it's in the word harm.
Yes.
And I think it's in the sense of what harms us is our response.
Yes.
And so, again, I use Jesus as the example of Jesus being the one who responded. Mary also responded completely in grace, responded completely without sin.
Yes.
And it's sin that harms us. Sometimes I've been falsely accused in the past of saying I'm blaming the victim by saying that.
Yes.
And that's not at all. I mean, it's ridiculous to blame the victim.
Yes.
But like some of the stories that I use in some of the books, when I talk about children that are wounded at a very young age,
yes,
and their response in their hearts set up a pattern.
Yes.
Now you could say, well, the event set up a pattern. Yes, but it's conceivable that they could have responded in many different ways and set up many different patterns And the harm was the response to the event and not just the event.
Yeah, that is such a, you can see how people would be resistant to accepting that perspective, because what it means then is I'm responsible for whatever happens to me in some way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah,
we'd have to be
I'm responsible to the
how I
spiritual
react.
condition of my soul, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting. I mean, this could go all over the place, but what I think we're bumping into is the concept of responsibility and blame and the will. I mean, it's really an anthropological question we're circling around, which is, I think, a great thing to re-mention is if you don't have really good anthropology, healing and psychology and restoration can go all kinds of wild places. And I think that's something that's so important for us to always come back to is what is my view of the human person? What is my view of change? What's my view of grace? And maybe a better way to say that would be what is true in each of those domains? What is the case? What is reality?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of theories out there, and they're not always, they don't all agree.
And we all have our own personal makeup that's influenced the way we see those things too. And, I look at events in my life that have been difficult and traumatic.
Yeah.
And those events are hurtful.
Yes.
They're really hurtful. And because of concupiscence, and I think there's a difference between us and Jesus and Mary, because of concupiscence, when we're young, we almost always are going to respond in a way that is going to create some harm inside of us. And again, it's not responsible in the sense of a confessable sin.
Yes.
But it's responsible in the sense of, I remember reading a book on sexual abuse years ago, and they said if a robber came to your house, the robber is responsible for his robbery, but he's not going to come back and clean it up, right? You're responsible for how you respond to the robbery.
Right.
And what you do with it after that. And I think that's the concept.
I think the word maybe we could put in there that would be an interesting nuance would be blame.
Yes.
And I think that's where responsibility and blame get used synonymously, and that's not what we're saying. Like another way to say it, blame would be it's your fault. Because that's a dynamic that we see come up all the time in people, especially when they're young, is, well, the only reason this happened is because I'm bad, which is another way to say it's my fault. And that's not at all
that's interesting, because what I wrote back to Kristen is I said, let's distinguish between name and shame and blame.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah.
And shame and blame came in through the fall.
Yes.
Naming is just being in the truth. And so if we can name an incident that happened,
yes,
and name the consequences and the experience of that, that's healing. But once we go into shame and go into blame, now we're moving out of healing and into responses that need to be healed.
It's such an interesting thing here, because just this discussion, which we would call the basics, it's so not basic. And I think that's something else in the basics and the review of the basics is we're talking about human beings, which are the most glorious, here also complex creatures in the universe. And so I think all of us approach healing looking for simple silver bullets where it's nice and tidy, and you do these 3 easy steps and all your problems get better. And we've talked about in other episodes and things where the concerns that I can say I have with regard to where healing might be going in the church context, et cetera, and making sure that it maintains its proper place as well as a proper understanding of it, because these things are so important. Because what it kind of, I think I'm realizing now as I say it out loud, it's proving the point that we're discussing right now, which is if I'm not responsible for my interiority, then who is?
Yeah.
And then a lot of anthropology and theology that we know to be the case and true blows up. It all starts to unravel. And then you have a very interesting dilemma of, well, then who is responsible for your interiority? And if you're waiting for the abuser to come take responsibility for your interiority, the chances are very slim that would ever occur. Like I'm, when I scan quickly all the people I've ever worked with, it's very rare that a childhood dynamic is the abuser comes back and repairs. Like that's very, very rare.
Yeah. And even in adulthood, how often do even adults come back and repair the damage that's been done?
Yeah.
It's more, but it's not always.
Yeah. It's very true. Well, that's a great provocative way to start it all off, Bob. I thought we were talking about the basics.
Threw you all off.
You're totally. Now I'm spinning and going into all these other spots and places, the areas that we could be talking.
Let me help make a bridge here.
Okay.
It's identity. It's, again, that's why I talk about shame and blame. Okay, go back to the anatomy of the wound.
Yeah.
Right? There's the event that happened, which wounds us. Could be a physical wound, could be an emotional wound, but the wound gets embedded in us through what we believe, and that belief is about ourselves, which goes into the shame, and the belief about the other, which goes into the blame, and then the vows that we make, which are the responses that we make to that trauma. So, basically what we're just doing is laying out kind of the foundations theologically and anthropologically for the anatomy of the wound.
Yeah, and some of the things I think that you're nuancing that are important that maybe the anatomy of a wound doesn't connect. And man, we could talk. I remember years ago, you and I talking about the anatomy of a wound, and I had a thing called the map of healing, and they were similar but different. And one of the things I think that you mentioned a few moments ago that's important is the role of concupiscence. Uh-huh. In other words, how I define concupiscence is if your goal is to climb uphill, you're always fighting against the resistance of gravity and the ground leaning away from uphill. Mm. Concupiscence means you're always walking uphill to some degree. And the less influence that it has, the better, because it's easier. The slope isn't as steep. But you take concupiscence and you add in there a whole whack of wounds and a bunch of vows and beliefs and lies, etc., disordered desires, etc., 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 etc. Like you're climbing a sheer face wall. It's hard work, not impossible, but it's hard. And grace is what breaks down and levels the road, and
path. Enables us.
Yeah, and enables us.
It's like the loss of grace at the fall is a loss of dignity, but it's also a loss of power. It's a loss of strength. It's a loss of capacity.
Yes.
And then it's also a disorder in the sense of, the way John Paul II talks about it, and St. John talks about it, is the pride of life, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes.
Yes.
And so if you think about that in terms of our responses,
yes,
the reason why it's so difficult is because we have this disconnection, and then we try to figure it out and solve it by ourselves from the youngest of ages. Mm. And then we look for things that are going to be the solution. That's the lust of the eyes. It's like, how are we going to comfort ourselves? And then the lust of the flesh are the areas where we find that comfort. And so we end up in sin just in our way of coping with response. And it's so ingrained in us because of concupiscence that from a young child, hardly any of us can escape that. That's why we're not sitting and blaming the victim.
Yes.
We're saying this is the inevitable reality of a fallen world.
Yes. And I think the next step there is, I think that most, I would imagine people can go, okay, but this is one of the things that's difficult about the healing realm, the world of healing. And man, this is such a painful reality is, let's assume, a rough case of childhood abuse. Mm-hmm. It's one of the most devastating things you can do to a human being. And so, and they didn't ask for it. Mm-hmm. But they're required to deal with it. Mm-hmm. That burden takes a lot of folks out, and how they handle that burden, because they're starting kind of, to use the idiom, they're starting behind the eight ball, and they didn't ask for it, they didn't want it, they didn't have any choice in the matter, but they're already starting with penalty strokes on their round of golf. Sorry, bad analogy, but anyway, and they're like, "What? That's not fair. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. And I have to deal with this." And, we're starting to touch into the realm of the problem of evil. and again, philosophically, anthropologically, theologically. And that's a zinger, the problem of evil. And healing is, how do we respond to this problem of evil in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah.
Which, all these various dynamics and all these things come up. So I want to bless people's desire to want healing. I think maybe you and I have experienced over the years that, I don't know if you find this, when you have somebody who's really excited about healing and they're just passionate about it, and I have this excitement with them, and I also have this sobering dynamic within me of going, oh, God bless you and God love you. And I hope for you that it's way smoother than it's been for me and everybody else I've worked with. But
Yeah.
like, you just know this is no easy road,
Yeah.
that, and almost that's kind of expected, which again brings up all these dynamics of why God, like, why you make it so hard, and et cetera, et cetera.
What Jesus say? It's the road to life is less traveled and difficult.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the road to life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the easy road is just going along with concupiscence and going along with the desires of the flesh and the desires of pride and everything else, and just going with it. But it's not easy in its consequence. It's harder.
Yes.
It's more damaging.
Yes.
That's what damages our soul.
And, if we don't honor the dynamics that we're discussing, this is one of the things, sorry, I'm half sentence there, but this is one of the difficulties of actually being true to a worldview or a theology or an anthropology, which that's what a worldview is. Basic assumptions you have about life, basic beliefs you have about life, is your worldview, to be coherent, needs to be consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we start taking things away in one domain, i.e. healing, shame, blame, the things that we were just talking about, then you also have to take them away in other areas and in other domains. And that's when things start massively breaking down, because you can write off sin real quickly in these domains. You can write off a lot of basic principles of reality. And so what's hard is that we're holding to those realities even when it's hard, because that's the way it is,
Yes. And it's the message of the church. It's the message of the gospel. And there's a tendency in the culture right now, and we talked about this in one of our last episodes, or previous episodes to the series on the identities, about how the culture now wants to define everyone as a victim.
Yes.
And we're not responsible for anything. It's just what's happened to us.
Yes.
Right? And that's really dangerous.
Agreed.
Because now there's no sin. There's only wounds.
Yes.
And if everybody's wounded and nobody sins, the benefit of that is it's not the opposite area, which is everything's sin, and we don't have any compassion for anybody's wounds.
Amen. That's good.
Right? So the middle road, the truth is in the middle of those two places.
Yes.
We have compassion. What is it? One of the saints said that we quote, I can't think of her name right now, but when God sees sin, he sees our hurt.
Oh, that's, I want to say, sorry, does it Julian of Norwich? Or I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. When God sees our sin, he sees our pain. I mean, God always sees beyond our sin with compassion to our wounds, to the places where we're hurting.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't excuse our sin. He forgives it.
Yes.
Right? Big difference.
And that's where, and then, man, I was not expecting to go here, but, and then it gets into the realms of culpability.
Right.
How can you hold a child responsible? Did they sin? All those dynamics.
Right.
And I think an example, like here's an example that I remember from a client that I worked with, just, the stories that we've seen. And some people might have a reaction to this story, but my intention is not to bring up a controversial issue. The two brothers were in a house, and their dad had a gun, and they didn't know the gun was loaded. Playing with the gun, one brother shot and killed his brother. So did he murder his brother? Right. So is
Yeah.
he, like, no, he didn't
No.
sin.
Yes.
Not at all. There was no sin there.
Right.
But
But
fast forward 45, 50 years later, and he was in my office and he is dealing with the reality of the action that he did
yes. Yeah.
and the absolute shame and lies and everything that came from that.
Yeah. A
Um,
good example. Yeah. Because there was real consequences,
yes, he did pull the trigger.
but not moral culpability.
Right. Yes, that was not his desire. He didn't want it. They were playing. They were playing a game. It was fun.
Yeah.
And then it went horribly wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we take this example with somebody who's sexually abused or
Right.
abandoned at a young age. Are they culpable for the sin?
No. Yeah.
No.
No.
Yeah. But are there real consequences
Yes.
for the
Yeah.
responses?
Yeah. Well, let's just pause for a moment because, I want to invite you listeners to just pause for a second and notice what's stirring. Because, Bob, it's in these spaces that often we start to tap into areas in our hearts that need healing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just start talking about a controversial thing or a person who bugged you. I mean, you're going to get triggered. And so my hunch is there's people who are just triggered right now. And it can feel cold. But that's not at all the reality of what's going on. You can say and hold to a difficult truth and still have immense compassion and care very, very deeply. Just look at the Gospels and Jesus's interactions with people. He's filled with compassion. And I mean, you notice it even with the blind man, I think, and you can see the apostles going when they said, "Whose fault is this?"
Yeah.
And they're in this domain of trying to figure out, why did this happen? He didn't have anything to do with it. Was it his parents' fault? Who's to blame?
Yeah. I think it was the Pharisees that were making
Were they?
those.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't remember who. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're in that domain, and his desires to heal the dynamic. And they're in one realm, a reality, a fair question.
Yeah.
And Jesus sees the person. Yeah. It's just such an interesting thing. So listeners, I just want you to notice that. And those kinds of things are the things that expose the deep layers of our heart. And it can be maddening, Bob. I know this in my own experience. If I don't face this thing that we're dialoguing about right now, life can be maddening.
Oh.
Because I don't have lines of people coming to my front door saying, "Let me take responsibility for everything that's ever happened to you." It's not happening. I'm the one that has to deal with the realities, a chunk of them that I had no choice over.
Yeah.
What am I going to do?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean part of our response can't be to go and address those things with those people. But if we sit and wait, that's the moving from a victim identity to a victor identity,
yes.
Like, victim, I can't do anything, I'm powerless here. And there is a real experience of powerlessness. It's one of the wounds there.
It is.
Right? And it's very easy in that and the hopelessness to adapt an identity of victim.
Yes.
But that identity of victim is a real obstacle to healing.
Yes.
Right?
I think one thing maybe that's worth nuancing too is it is appropriate to judge an action.
Correct. Name it.
Name it. And what we're saying is to the abuser, you abused. And I think that's where people can hear it wrongly and go, so it didn't matter? Oh, no. It matters immensely. And they did it.
Uh-huh.
And so this is where Jesus has this nuance of the greater sin.
Yeah.
Where he talks about, but they have committed the greater sin.
Yeah.
And so,
and he says, if you wound one of these little ones, it'd be better for a millstone to be put around your neck and thrown into the sea.
Yeah, I've said it before. It's the most gangster thing you've ever heard Jesus say. Like, that's full mobster like language. Like, what? Like, throw a cinder block around your neck and chuck you in the river. Like, whoa, that's like Davy Jones' locker kind of stuff. So there is an acknowledgement. And I think, again, we're holding all these things in tension as we're approaching and like, what is this stuff? What is healing again? What is all of this? That there are components that have to be addressed. And one of them is naming the realities, particularly the abuser did this and they did it to me.
And what they're responsible for and what
Yes.
I'm not responsible for. I'm not responsible for the abuse. I'm not responsible for
Yes.
what they did.
Yes. And to go back to Father Jacques Philippe's phrase, I am responsible for my interiority.
Right.
And it's possible in that interiority, I did things that didn't help me.
Almost inevitably.
Because I'm walking an uphill battle, thanks Adam and Eve.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is an in-depth analysis we're doing here of a phrase that I like to say when I talk about the basics and talk about healing, and that is, there's a way things work.
Mm.
And that's just a simple way to summarize the complexity of the human condition, of the human person and human nature, of the dynamics of the will and sin and et cetera, et cetera. There is a way things work. There is reality. And somebody I was just reading said, mental health is the degree to which you accept reality.
Yeah. I remember in graduate school reading he was really not well received, but one of the kind of radical people in the field said, we are mentally ill to the sick to which we've avoided reality.
Say that again. We're mentally ill.
We're mentally ill to the extent to which we avoid reality.
Okay. Same thing, just the inversion of what I'm saying. Right. Why do you think why would people be reactive to that?
Again, because it places a sense of responsibility.
Okay. Yeah. In other words, if we honor that there's a way things work and something bad happened to me, I still have to do something about it.
Yeah. And I have to face reality. And sometimes, again, come back to the compassion. Sometimes the reality is so overwhelming.
Yes.
That I got to do everything else but face reality until I'm ready to face reality.
Yes. And I need divine assistance to face reality.
Yes.
And that's where heaps and heaps of truckloads of grace, like Dallas Willard, who's a Protestant philosopher and author, he's very Catholic friendly, really like him. He has this phrase, saints burn through grace like a 747 burns through fuel at takeoff. Just guzzling it down. There's very poor efficiency, fuel economy in the realm of grace, and that's intended. We're just supposed to devour it and then need more and more and more and more of it. So there's a way things work, and that is a critical foundational point to healing. And in some ways, that is what the study of psychology is attempting to do, is to comprehend and articulate the way things work for the human person, in particular in our psychology. And the sad part is, in my mind, there's a lot of misunderstanding about reality, and then you see the fruit of that in the psychological world.
Yeah, so. And applying that in a way that's consistent with the church is there is not just a physical law, but there's a moral law.
Yes.
Right? And when we look at the moral law, just like gravity has its effects,
yes.
And if you go against gravity, you feel the effects. If you go against the moral law, whether you are aware or not aware, the guy who fell off the building and the guy who jumped off the building both die.
Yes.
Right? And so in moral law, when we violate the principles of moral law, there's consequences.
Yes.
Whether intended or not, whether we have culpability or not.
Yes.
We still have responsibility to address those things.
There's a way that it works. And let's take it one step further now. This could be perceived as cold and heartless by God. And I think there would be an initial lie.
Yes.
So notice how quickly we can discover lies as we're just simply acknowledging the reality of the way things work about healing. We can say, you could have the lie toward God, which using the language of the anatomy of a wound, it's a type of belief, in particular, a judgment against God. You're not kind. You're harsh. you're unloving, you don't care, whatever version of that might be. And that would be a judgment.
Uh-huh.
You can understand why someone would arrive at that judgment. However, that judgment has effect, and it's impacting you and impacting your healing journey. I mean, it's one of the things that, where was I just, it was another book that I was reading that talks about, if you're going to dive into the realm of healing, one of the first things that has to be healed is your image of God, because you're not going to get far. If he's unkind, he's cruel, he's whatever, then you try to play that song and dance in a healing realm, and you just don't go anywhere because you're not dealing in reality.
Which is why, going back to dealing with reality, why reading and understanding the scripture and the church's teaching is so critical, because we can notice when we read God defining himself as full of compassion.
Yes.
And full of mercy and compassion, compassionate to every creature, that's the biblical truth. And then we can read other scriptures where we say, God's saying, wipe out all of the nation. And you say, well, what happened to compassion?
Yeah.
Right? It's like our hearts react out of a place of a belief, not understanding, because we're not capable of understanding how God could both be just and compassionate at the same time.
Yes. We find ourselves right back staring at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And tons of compassion there. That's a tough spot to be. Like, everybody's like, oh, if I was back there, I would have smacked the apple out of Eva's hand, or Eva, man, that's my daughter. Sorry, Eva. Eve's hand, and been like, what are you doing? This, like, come on. Like, let's not presume that we've got it all figured out and have it all together. Like, I think that you want to know what you would do. Like, the best thing, this is what I've said to myself, like, what would I have done? Well, look at how I live my life. That's a pretty good indicator of what I would have done, because I'm doing it. The tree is still happening. That whole dynamic is still live.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Bob, let's go here now. What is healing then? And so I'll kick us off, and let's see if we can make it integrate at all.
Okay.
So when, back to the basics. Well, how about let's define our terms, which is a very good thing that in the basics realm. Here's some things that I reflected on. What is healing? It's the process of being restored to God's intention, our original God-given glory. Another way to say it is the process of being restored into being whole and holy again, being restored to a right relationship with God, being restored to, these are key words for me, what we are and who we are. So that's being restored in our nature and our identity. How do those strike you, and what would you nuance?
Yeah, that's good. I like all of that, and the way we define it in some of our Healing the Whole Person is healing is an ongoing encounter with God's love and truth that brings us into wholeness and communion, which captures everything that you just said.
Is there anything that's nuanced there?
I think it's just a different way of saying the same thing.
Okay.
It's focusing on encountering God as the source of our healing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's talking about wholeness as holiness and growing, becoming the person we're intended to be.
Yes.
And communion as developing a right relationship with God, and God's love and truth being in there together as the means to that process. So that, again, it's a right understanding of who we are as human beings.
Yes.
Dealing with reality, that's truth. And love, which is the compassion, the tenderness, the willing of our good. All of those are a part of the healing process, the restoring.
I've said this before, Bob, and I think it bears repeating. I've said this. I think I'm confident I've said it too many times, that I remember when you and I first started, when we started the podcast, and we've talked about these things for a long time now, that I had a definition of healing that I didn't even realize was kind of there. And the more that you and I interacted, I realized, Bob's nuancing things that I'm not, and they really matter. And I think the way that I would have defined healing way back in the day would have been the removal of my problems And I would define it now, I think, in a way much more consistent to how I originally experienced you defining it, which is holiness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, notice the difference. And the difference really matters, because if healing is simply the removal of my pain, then the means by which I do that and the result get you a certain degree, but you could have pain removed and still not be holy.
Mm-hmm.
That, as silly as it sounds, you could accomplish that in a drug addiction. You could accomplish that by swiping on your phone 24/7. You could take away pain, and people have been attempting to do that for millennia. But that doesn't mean you've actually experienced healing. And I think one of the critical components of healing is the concept of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean freedom in the sense of I get to do whatever I want. I mean freedom in the sense of I don't have chains binding me to things that make me do something that I don't want to do. But I have the capacity to will the good. I have capacity, and I want it.
Yeah.
Because that's my design. That's how I was made. And so even that little nuance matters there. And so I think it's rampant right now, and I could be wrong, but I think it's rampant that people have the definition that I used to hold of healing.
Mm.
And we approach God going, why aren't you healing me?
Yeah.
Hear that as, why aren't you making my life easy?
Yeah.
Why aren't you taking away my pain?
It's a good place to start. I've got pain and it motivates me to move into it. But if we stay stuck to that definition, we're going to soon give up the healing process.
Yeah. And here's a crazy a thought. It's possible that the pain is healing.
Yes. Yeah.
And that people are, what the heck? You've gone off your rocker. Like, take that guy's license. But the point is, what's the goal? What's the end?
Yeah.
What's the intention? And again, we're honoring truth regardless of how it feels. We're honoring an adequate, deep understanding of the human person regardless of how it feels, aka reality. And so I've experienced it where pain is actually healing, because pain at times gets rid of selfishness.
Yeah.
Pain can motivate you to stop acting in a particular way. And the undergirding of the reasons of why you're acting in that way are actually causing the pain. But if the pain just went away, I wouldn't appreciate at all a process. I wouldn't appreciate my own dignity. I would, there's so many layers there. So
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, when you think about freedom, I think about Jesus saying anyone who sins becomes enslaved to sin. And it's not that we lose completely our free will, but our free will becomes hampered by those choices. And so, again, coming back to the place of what damages our soul is sin.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that damages our soul.
And do you mean there, and I think you do, it's not just what I sin. It's also the sin that was done unto me damages my soul, and how I react to that which is sinful.
Well, if I go back to the Jacques Philippe definition, he would only say, what I do is what damages my soul. But I think the sins of others certainly affects us in our soul.
Yes, that's what I mean.
It's that word harm. What is that harm? What does harm mean?
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
Yep. So sin always damages us.
Yes.
Other people's sin and our own sin. But harm, I think, is related to our sin. That's the only thing that affects our holiness. Nobody else can affect our holiness.
Yes. Thus the responsibility piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nobody else can take away our freedom.
Nuance what you mean there.
Well, let's look at
back in the original discussion?
Let's look at St. Paul.
Yeah.
Or Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? His exterior freedom was taken away. He's thrown in prison.
Yes.
He's beaten. He's clubbed. He's, all kind of events happen to him. But he's in the prison, chained physically, but not chained spiritually or in his soul. He's singing to God. And then when the chains are broken in the earthquake, he's ministering to the person because he's free.
Yes.
In that place. Jesus is able to, from the cross, look at John and Mary and minister to his mother and the beloved disciple from the cross and forgive the people that did it because his soul is free.
Yes.
in that place, even though his body is totally helpless and powerless and he can barely breathe.
Yeah, that's an important. I think that's why I like that you nuance that, because again, we're bumping into an anthropological reality that bears all kinds of nuancing. But again, when we're talking about healing, we're not talking about some simple like 1, 2, 3, poof, it's all better. This is complex realities. That's why, when we originally started the podcast, we were like, we can do 1,000,000 episodes and you still could keep talking about it because it's rich.
Yeah.
But the nuance that you're making is that my body can be bound, but my soul can be free. And I'm just going to set up the dilemma, and we can go into it in another argument, is anthropologically that creates somewhat of a need for nuance, because as a human person, I'm
body
not,
and soul.
I am one, you
Yeah.
know?
Yep.
So how does that work? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I don't know if you want to have a quick response, or we leave that and people go, come on.
Yeah. I'm going to leave that for a second and use another analogy.
Okay, go there.
Okay. As a team, we're reading Father Walter Chizik's book, He Leadeth Me.
Yes.
And
great book.
Every chapter is just more and more sobering and more confrontive of my own weaknesses. And he tells the story of the freedom of his soul in the most inhumane circumstances that we can imagine. And every event is more painful than the one before that. And he himself falls prey to the places in his own heart that aren't free until he begins to accept everything as God's will, which is an outlandish concept.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But I'm here out of God's will, not God's perfect will. This isn't what God desires for me, but this is where God has placed me.
Yeah, permissive will.
Yeah. And in that, you see him making these deeper and deeper surrenders and this purification of his heart and this growth in wholeness and holiness, even while he's being tortured, or even while he's barely getting enough food, or even while he's deprived, but the joy that he has in the Mass and being able to serve people once he's in. And just all of that is so confrontational to me.
Yes.
Because of the way I complain about the little sufferings that I have, the ways that I begin to feel sorry for myself for the ways that people treat me, that it's against my dignity. When, it's like to such an extreme, and yet to see the response of his heart eventually, and he doesn't get there easily.
Yes.
But you see the journey that he makes. And now, by the end of it, here's a man who's free, even though he's in prison.
You know what? There's a nuance that is coming as you talk about it. This is part of the reason I like to ask questions, is because I process as people talk and I talk. So his freedom was found because he assented. He said yes to the bondage in a way. You know what I mean? He said yes to the imprisonment.
Yeah, he said yes to God in the midst of the imprisonment.
That's what I mean. Yeah. And so therefore his body is free. In other words, I have the freedom to do whatever. I have the freedom to do what I choose to do with my body. And in his case, he said, I surrender completely to God what you will or you allow.
Yeah. And it didn't mean his body didn't suffer or his soul didn't suffer.
Absolutely. He freely said yes to that.
Yeah. Which is what Jesus did on the cross, right? Nobody takes my life from me. I give it up freely.
Bingo.
Okay.
And so
are we advocating that somebody who's being physically abused or sexually abused
should just
assent to that? No.
And that nuance matters, because there are situations where your no ends the dynamic. In his case, being imprisoned, there's nothing he can do about it. So if the chains fell off and the door opens, what should he do? Well, in right mind, he should walk out the door. You know what I mean? Like, like Paul, he shouldn't go, no, I stay here now because the Lord has changed the situation.
Yeah.
And so
Paul did stay there, but that's another matter, right?
But he eventually left.
He eventually left. Yes.
Yeah. It's not like, the Lord kept the door open. He didn't say like,
there's going to be a very provocative statement, and I may be wrong.
Okay. Good nuance. Fair.
I just want to throw this out there, because I'm thinking about the people that I've walked with who have had incredible abuse physical, sexual abuse. And they were totally powerless. As we go back to the memory, they have no freedom of body.
Yes.
Right? They can't get out of the situation. And there's always a very difficult, dealing with the powerlessness and the degradation and the feeling tarnished and shamed and hopeless and abandoned and unprotected, and just so much that's in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it just gut-wrenching even to walk with somebody there, let alone be the person who's walking into it. But there's something in the process as they encounter God, and first of all, the abandonment from God. God, how could you let this happen?
Yep.
But there's something that happens in the process as we enter into that and deal with the reality and face it. In a certain sense, I see many of them encounter God in such a way in the midst of it, like Jesus does on the cross.
Yes.
At some point in the healing process. Again, I don't want to overstate this, and this could be wrong. But in a certain sense, they're doing like what Father Walter did, which is to accept the reality of their powerlessness and, in a sense, say, no one takes my life from me. I give it freely now.
Yes.
God, here.
Yes.
I don't know. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. You're making a very deep psychological, spiritual, possibly even mystical statement. And so a lot of the nuances are necessary, and you've done that. So I think that bears in mind. Actually, where my mind went was Maria Goretti.
Oh, yes. Yes.
She lived that experience.
Yes.
And
beautiful.
And I don't know the story in depth, but if I recall, she appeared to her abuser and murderer and forgave him.
In prison.
In prison, and forgave him.
After she died, she appeared to him spiritually and forgave him.
Yes.
Presented, I think, 14 lilies for the 14 stabs.
Yeah, 14 flowers. Yeah, exactly. And he was present at her canonization.
Yeah. And now he's up for canonization, I think.
Like, hold the phone, just as a footnote. Like, what the? That's just, anyway, like, go and munch on that one for a little bit.
We have a listener who I was moved to give my Maria Goretti relic to.
Wow.
Who had been raped. And she went over and visited the site and had a big movement in her healing, just visiting the home of Maria Goretti and walking through all of that.
Wow. That's beautiful.
So if you're listening, I won't mention names, but just thinking about honor, you.
Yeah, honoring to her. When you share that, I hear what you're saying. Let me say it different. You're not saying, yes, I agree, I like this, I want this. That's not what you're saying.
Not at all. And Walter didn't say that. Jesus didn't say that. Paul
didn't say that.
Yeah. It's an evil.
Yes. What I am hearing you say is, Jesus, I trust that even in the midst of the worst evil, that if I surrender to you, you can do something with it.
Yes.
Where another option would be, Jesus, I hate this evil and I will perpetually fight it.
Yes. Yes.
And that has some sense in it.
And I hate you too for letting this happen.
Now we're into a different domain. But what I'm hearing described there, and let's nuance this even further theologically, that is a heroic response. There's a heroic virtue there.
Tremendous grace to get to that.
Tremendous grace to get there. This isn't something like you take the boulder on your backpack and walk it up the hill. Like that's impossible without the help of supernatural intervention. And yet it happened. What's funny, Bob, is that as you're saying it, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I have seen the same in my work with the, similar types of the stuff that you just can't repeat because it's so bad.
Yeah. Think about Jesus saying, do not resist an evil person, right? But how about if we applied that to all of our wounds?
Keep going.
how about if Jesus' statement in the present is also part of our healing in the past, whereas we're constantly trying to resist the evil that we've experienced?
Mm-hmm.
And what if we stop resisting and return good for evil, which is what forgiveness is?
This is the Beatitudes. This is Sermon on the
Yeah.
Mount.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your conclusion there then? That would be healing?
I think it's reality. It's the gospel,
Yes.
right? The only
Yeah.
way we can be healed is when we live in conformity with the truth of who we are, which is living the Beatitudes, living the message of the Sermon on the Mount, which
Yes.
is so foreign to our natural response.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great indicator that concupiscence exists. Go read the Beatitudes and see how naturally that comes to you. Yeah. and for people who have dealt with a lot of the wounds and their hearts are aligned to God, the Beatitudes are more easy, normal. It's like
Yeah. And let me again come back to compassion. We're laughing not because we're laughing at the damage that's been done
no.
from the things that have happened. It's horrific. Jake and I have been with and wept with so many people
Yes.
going through so much stuff, and we weep with all the stuff that you've gone through
Yes.
and are going through. So don't hear any of this as laughing at the trauma. Okay, it's horrific. It's evil.
Yes.
I'm not sure what I was laughing at, but I think, in a sense, the laughing is at how ridiculous it is that the gospel message totally turns everything upside down, and we're undone by it.
Yes.
We're made new in it.
Yes. Bob, I think I appreciate what you're doing right there, because what you're highlighting, I think, this is a nice back to the basics concept, a bit outside of the domain, is the reality of podcasting. You and I are having a conversation and we're risking recording it and letting other people listen to it.
Yeah.
And we both know that in our conversation, that our laughter is in no way, because we know each other very well.
Yeah.
And if there was the slightest indication that the laughter was something that wasn't coping, as a way to put it, we would not be okay with it. You know what I mean? Like we both know that. And I think that's just an interesting nuance, because we aren't looking face to face at the 50,000 people listening to this.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult in the reality of podcasting. And we do that. We're very attentive to the person who's in front of us,
and for both of us, one of the things that's been true for each of us is we've probably been overly serious in our lives because of the level of trauma that we've walked with. And it's relieving to be able to laugh.
It's one of the ways to cope with it. It is. Yeah. That's a whole other thing. The vicarious trauma stuff. I mean, that we could have lots of stories about the sleepless nights and the
weight of
carrying and holding that with many, many people at the same time. And actually carrying.
Yeah.
It's not easy to do in the midst of it. But I appreciate the sensitivity, because we do want to be sensitive to it. And everybody's at a different space in the journey. And so if they hear us laughing, I appreciate that sensitivity. We're getting close to the end of our time. I wonder if we can just do some quick hitters here while acknowledging. Notice how we basically got through like one sentence of an idea, and there's so many layers to it, and unpacking it. It's just so complex, the stuff that we're talking about and addressing and looking at. And so, we got into this, like, there's a way things work. What is healing? You mentioned it a second ago, but what actually heals, I think, is a wonderful thing. And very quickly, if I could go back to your definition that you use, God's love, communion is what heals. The nuances, it's the same thing. It's like taking a diamond and turning and seeing its very facets. I love to reflect on not only the facets of God, I like to nuance here: truth, beauty, and goodness. Those are they're called the attributes of God, I think, is the theological term. What I actually find that's helpful in the definition of healing is a person, God, and relationship and communion with him. Another way to say that is, what do you get when you're in that relationship with God? You're going to get truth, beauty, and goodness. Well, where does the truth, beauty, and goodness comes from? He's dripping everywhere. His fingerprints are everywhere. And so you can have a healing encounter with beauty and not realize that the source and origin is actually God. And, people will have, I was looking at the tree and it was so beautiful. I looked at the flower or the sun or whatever. And you're going, yeah, you're indirectly tasting and seeing the goodness of the Lord. And that can be crazily healing. Also, this is a very prominent one, the love of my neighbor, like the person in front of me, can be very healing. But again, its source and origin goes back to the ultimate truth, beauty, and goodness. So what heals? Communion with God and all of the forms that he loves to commune with us.
Yeah, good.
Yeah,
good. It's a good place to end, I think.
Yeah, let's pause there.
Yeah,
any final thoughts?
Yeah, just what you mentioned before. This is why we call our podcast Restoring the Glory, because it's being brought into the wholeness that God intended and beyond, into the glory of who we are as human beings that we won't realize until we're in heaven.
Yeah.
But if we have that vision of being able to see ourselves and see one another with that viewpoint, what C.S. Lewis talked about, each one of us is more glorious than we could ever imagine.
Amen. Thanks, listeners. We hope that this blessed you, and we'll keep circling around these topics throughout the whole course of this podcast and nuancing and all of that. And looking forward to some episodes coming up with you with some special guests who we're excited about. I'm looking forward to this season 2, continuing on in the journey. And we're hoping again that this blesses you, and we will talk to you again soon.